we'll begin. This is a session on knowledge discovery, synthesis, and application at the forest science management interface. My name is Nalini Nadkarni. I'm a forest ecologist and a professor at the University of Utah Department of Biology, and I am moderating this very distinguished and very fun panel on forest knowledge at the interface of science and management. Well, all of us know, and we've been hearing all week about how forests are complex and diverse entities, and those who study them use diverse tools and approaches to understand and manage them. Peter Doherty, who introduced this session, brought our panel together to incubate some ideas and questions about this overarching question. How can we effectively integrate the many ways of understanding forests to create better paradigms to manage them? Now you'll see and you'll hear in just a few minutes that our panel encompasses many of these diverse approaches. You've already heard about the large-scale geographic approach of Jack Dangermond, of the smaller sort of place-based approaches of David Haskell. We encompass ethical, spiritual, and community approaches to managing forests. And we also want to ask in this panel, how do these many ways of knowing complement each other? This is a very difficult question. We're not going to answer it in an hour, but I thought that we might start by using the metaphor of a lens, of a crystal that has many lenses. It's obviously clear. You can look through it to see your object of interest, that is a forest or trees, but that because of there are many facets to it, each of us comes to understand forests in a different way. We see different images. We answer different questions. And so what we want to do is understand that each view is valid from the standpoint of that vantage, but the integration into a composite that makes sense for management then I think is our mutual challenge. So this morning we want to think about various approaches from the abstract, which Jack talked about, to the small place-based, which David talked about, and include the other panelists' views as well. We also invite you to think about the facets that each of you brings to understanding forestry. And so I invite each of our panelists and each of you to think about this lens that you use and how that fits into the bigger picture of understanding and managing forests. So onward, this is a conversation. This is kind of an experiment. This is not lecturing you as you've been lectured to many times this week, but rather, well, actually we met last night and began talking, and we realized that all of the questions that we had prepared, we sort of threw out the window, and we just agreed that we would have a lively conversation amongst ourselves and with you in a sort of abstract way to think about this question, this overarching question of integrating research and management. Now, because of our very short time frame, just 1 hour, and because there are 3,500 of you in the audience, we can't sort of handle the logistics of people asking questions. But we do have a Twitter feed, and we invite you to join the conversation at #ForestIQ. And I think that will be coming up on the panel. Okay. So introductions is how we'll start out, then we'll open the conversation. At the very end, I'm going to ask you guys if you have any insights into how we can integrate those different facets of each of your approaches, and to try to come up with this idea that Peter presented at the very beginning of, now that we know about these aspects, these approaches, these facets of knowledge, how do we shift them perhaps to turn into wisdom about our forests? So some quick introductions. You heard Jack Dangermond, many of you, who's the founder of ESRI. He runs a geographic information systems company, and he uses the approach of geographical information to problem solving at very large scales. Welcome, Jack. Thanks. David, his work integrates scientific and contemplative studies of the natural world at place-based, with a place-based approach and a very small meter squared sort of scale. So again, welcome, David. I want to introduce Mila Alvarez. She's an expert in natural resources policy, management, and decision-making. So she presents another facet of our forest crystal. And I'd like to introduce you, Mila, if it's okay, to ask you a question. And that way we can get to know each other a bit in this conversation. Tell me how your view of what can be known about forestry changed over time, and maybe why, just in a few minutes.
Sure. She told me I have 4 or 5.
Yeah.
So I'll try to keep it tight. My understanding of knowledge has changed through my life, but what is knowledge indeed? For me, it's a constant evolution that represents how we evolve as a species since we are here in Earth. If we think about the theories that were in the past universally admitted and embraced, as for example, Ptolemy's concept of the universe that placed the Earth in the center and the Sol and the Sun orbiting around us, it was a well-known theory that it was embraced. Today we know that is not the case. The universe is constantly expanding at an accelerated rate, and who knows what we are going to discover 1,000 years from now that we are going to say, oh, how could they be thinking that that was a universal concept? So knowledge has evolved through our humankind, but knowledge also evolves as humans, as an individuals, through our lifetime experiences. We certainly don't think the same way when we are in our teenagers years than when we are in our 40s or 60s or later on in life. The other factor that affects knowledge, in my opinion, is the environment. If you see images of a human brain of a 3-year-old child, you will see that a perfectly normal child has a shape and a format with neural connections established. If you will see the human brain of a 3-year-old child that has been neglected, it is kind of shocking to see the effects that the environment is having in the biophysical development of that human. So if in reality what is influencing me as a person and my capacity to understand what is around me, which is knowledge, is limited by my own evolution as a species and my environment as a way of evolving throughout my life, what is reality? Is reality really what we see and perceive, or is reality a universal statement that is out there? And I think is the first. I think reality is what our sensors, as David was describing before, allowed us to perceive, and our brains, as their own evolution, allowed us to process in our heads. So I am not who I am. And that's kind of, for me, a wake-up call. I am not who I am. I am thousands of opinions out there as you are perceiving me right in this moment. And realizing about that, it gives me a different perspective of what reality is all about and how knowledge is going to evolve based on what we can know as an individual. My background is in mathematics. I'm a forest engineer. Most of my academic experience are in the fields of engineering and computer modeling, GIS. And most of my professional life has been focused on policy and management and how to apply and make others understand how to use information and how to transform it in ways that people can use it in their everyday lives. But if I can share with you what has enriched me and gives me a different insight and perspective of knowledge, it's been this other life enrichment experience, is these other disciplines that are not directly connected to my profession in natural resources. And I would like to bring 3 examples today. Yes, it is psychology, the study of the universe, and genetics. And I'll be happy to go more into those, but I think for me, understanding these other disciplines that have given me the power and the vision to see forestry and how forestry is applied and how knowledge is applied in my profession has made me see different perspectives and the uniqueness of how can contribute to solutions to our environment. And finally, connecting these disciplines, as Jack was saying, integrating these other concepts that are not directly related to our profession. You know, how psychology can make me understand you as better and helps me to turn my worst enemy into my best ally in a working team. You know, concepts like that. Connecting the dots and making those connections in my brain is what it has helped me. And also being able to see this information and knowledge through 2 lenses that I think are very important. One is the geographic lenses that has been very well described in here today, but the other one is temporal scales. We are limited by the human condition of our own lifespan. However, by learning more and more about the universe and what we are in that humongous time space, makes me realize that the time scale is a key concept that unfortunately we don't infuse it in our everyday work. And I would leave it as that.
Thanks, Mila. Sally Collins is an innovator in the field of environmental markets, and she's also an advocate for securing land tenure arrangements for forest communities. So, Sally, I think you bring to us a different kind of facet of this crystal, which is about the integration of communities into forestry understanding.
Yeah.
Please just give us a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'll try to be
just
fast,
zoom through it to get to this question, please.
Well, first of all, I worked as a forest supervisor at a local level to the associate chief of the Forest Service and to environmental markets for a few years, and now I work internationally for a small NGO. And every position I've had has required information, but one of the things I've learned is how much I didn't know. And if you don't expose yourself to new stuff, you don't learn what you need to know. That all changed for me, or not all changed, but one event is memorable to me, and I want to share it really quickly. 2005, I was invited to a conference in Beijing, China. And it was a conference on tenure reform in China, which is pretty radical, convened by Rights and Resources Initiative. Many of the partners of RRI are here at this conference. And I met Tasso Azevedo. I don't know how many of you all have met Tasso Azevedo. You will remember him if you meet him. He was this young, early 30s, charismatic, very smart as a whip, very creative guy, architect of the Amazon Fund, architect of the Brazilian Forest Service, and first chief of the Brazilian Forest Service later. But he and I sat down at this meeting in Beijing in like this kind of conversation we had. And we started talking about the problems we were facing in our respective countries: deforestation, illegal logging, government corruption, the conversion of land due to agriculture and mining, and how the different sectors of government don't talk to each other. All of these things were causing huge challenges. 80% of the world's poorest people live in and depend on forests for their livelihood. They're striving for their rights. There's a lot of conflict out there. So we said, let's do something different. So we created what we founded as Megaflorist Ice. There's some cards out there, you guys can see them. We've been meeting for almost a decade now, creating an informal network of the 15 leaders of public forest agencies around the world. Once a year, we've created, I think, David, you might agree, it's like a mandala, a safe place where you can exchange ideas and leaders can really understand in a deep way what's going on in our respective forests. And for me, it's transformed what I learn, what I know, and what's relevant to my work. So let me just end it with that.
Thank you, Sally. And I love your point of if we don't know what we don't know, then we will continue to not know it. And I think
and act on that.
Exposure, as what's going on here at this conference, sort of your entity writ large is going on here in terms of people figuring out what they don't know and then seeking to fill those holes. So thanks for that input.
You bet.
Mike Wingfield, glad you're here, is a researcher on tree pests, pathogens, and tree health. And Mike, I want to ask you this quick question to introduce you. In your career, what do you think is the most innovative method that you've experienced in acquiring science-based knowledge and making it useful to managers?
Nalini, thanks. Your description of me is maybe a little bit different to my own description of me. And many times people ask, what do you do?
It's a different facet of you, Mike.
The worst is when people ask your children what your dad does, and that's a different story. I'm a microbiologist, entomologist, and I see the world through a lens, in a sense. It's a very, very small world, and David had me thinking a lot about the small world. You ask a question about what's that one technology that changed your life? Amazingly, and I said this to David last night, probably a hand lens. It's a very small, and I think everybody that heard the plenary this morning saw. You have it with you. See, it's an incredibly simple piece of technology. My one magnifies 10 times, and 10 is very good. 20 is terrible because you just see too much then. This one just changes one's life. So I came to see this small world in a way that other people couldn't see the small world. Once one has seen, for instance, a fungus on a stick with a hand lens, and with your own eyes, with our own eyes, we don't see that detail. one sees every level further up that one has seen with other instruments. For instance, a dissecting microscope, a compound microscope, an electron microscope, and so forth. So once you've seen them at those higher levels, when one sees this with a hand lens,
Nice.
you see all of that other stuff. It's all in your head. So it's the most amazing piece of technology. And this sounds a little eclectic, but let me just take that point one step further to the management question you asked. My job very heavily relies upon communication with forest managers. They rely on us to inform them about these pests and diseases that are killing trees all over the world. And the real challenge is how to communicate this story, this information about the hand lens and all these organisms that they cannot see, they cannot even imagine. And that really is a huge challenge. What David talked about for instance, the microbiome, the fact that a needle on, I'm not sure what these pines are, but anyway, it's not an African pine, maybe a western white pine or something like that, pinyon pine. Anyway, inside that needle, thousands of species, few culturable and thousands that we know are there, but we don't know what they're doing. How does one communicate that message to a manager who has to think about some of them potentially wiping out the forest? So there is the challenge.
Yes, that is a challenge. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for all of you for those introductions. So I think we're ready to go with this big question, this overarching question, and I'll just repeat it. Again, I want to remind you about the Twitter feed. If you'd like to Twitter in at hashtag ForestIQ, that would be great. So I'm going to repeat the question and open it up. I've got a ginger ale here. I know, Mike, you've got a Diet Coke, and I think we're ready to go. Is that right? Great. So how can we effectively integrate the many ways of understanding forests to create the best paradigms for management? And following that, how do we juxtapose these different facets of our forest crystal to sustain forests around the world? So I'm not going to call on anybody. I trust that my brilliant colleagues here will take it and run with it.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Well, one thing I think we absolutely have to do is slow down and be deliberate. And I think that's what the hand lens metaphor is, and the crystal and the mandala, because we are racing through and doing really urgent things all the time, and we're busy and we're out of breath and we're constantly, we've got an adrenaline rush going through our body, but we are missing in that process so much. So I just, when I heard you speak a couple of nights ago for the first time, I went, this is it. We need to slow down, and we need to really be deliberate about how we look at these things, and rather than racing around trying to do too much.
Experience life.
Experience life and experience each other in the process.
You know, that's all very well, but we can't, you know, that's the one side. And I was inspired, David, by the idea that I should slow down and think, and we've got Ebola killing people at a huge speed, and we have no knowledge. So we need to slow down and think, but we have to deal with the real world, which is super fast. It's lightning. So, you know, is that realistic? You know, let's take more time off and sit under a tree, and I'm thinking about this a lot after the lecture this morning, but is that enough?
So it seems like go ahead, David, please.
Yeah, I would say that there is if we look at the traditions of contemplative practice, often what we find is the contemplative life is engaged with a life of action as well. So it's not either or, it's the two go together. Yeah. So if you look at the daily rhythm of a nun in Mother Teresa's hospitals, they're doing a lot of work. And yet, here is this time of, I don't know exactly their schedule, having never lived that life, but here are these times through the day where, you know, they're in a particular religious tradition where it's set aside for prayer and for stepping back. And so there's this inhale and exhale, just like the heart goes through a systole and a diastole. We need to incorporate both of those. And I don't think that they are in conflict with one another. People who've incorporated these practices in their lives find that they sustain us, that it stops burnout. Because what happens when you're action all the time, well, that's great, you can sustain it as long as you've got enough coffee and as long as your heart is holding out and mental health. But then at some point, something gives. And we all know this in multiple levels, in multiple organizations. Burnout is a huge issue. So how can you have the inhale and the exhale sustaining one another? And the great thing is, those relationships say having a daily practice of just checking in with a tree for 1 minute. That 1 minute becomes a very important anchor point in the whole day that might sustain you over many hours and provide wisdom when you add that minute up over 10 years, for example.
So it sounds like what's been presented so far is that we presented first this dichotomy between the two of you of a very large scale in space and very small scale in space. But what you've brought up, Mike and David, is there's another dichotomy which is very short term and very long term. So there's the two axes we have to sort of think about. And I wonder if that has something to do with our topic here in terms of understanding those kinds of knowledge at those different spatial and temporal scales can help us with management.
Well, think about forestry. This is trees grow slowly over long periods of time. Nalini, your field is looking at, if I remember our conversation earlier in the year, studying the canopies of trees up there for years and years. Those things are sitting up there doing stuff, but it's long term. But a lot is going on very rapidly, I suppose, at another level. That is a frustration in terms of forestry knowledge.
Mila, do you have something?
Yes, talking about time scales. I think we, within the profession of natural resources, we do acknowledge and are very conscious that, you know, most of the natural ecosystems function in these larger scales that go beyond our human one. And perhaps what we struggle is that we live in a culture that is so focused in present moment that, you know, from policy decisions to like the implications of management in the society, and perhaps the society itself doesn't kind of slow down and wonder, you know, what are the long-term implications? And unfortunately, our human scale prevails in the decisions that we make, in the way we operate, in our own, as researchers, in the way we do it, because we know we are not going to be here 80 years from now to continue monitoring, you know, that 1 square meter that you were talking about, and therefore that's limiting our capacity to speak in the language of the time dimension of those ecosystems that go for sometimes even centuries.
Well, so what's the incentive in your organization, Jack, or in any of our organizations to slow down, to give people time to explore these sort of alternative ways of thinking or experiencing or learning outside these disciplines that you talk about? What's the incentive? How do we create it? What are you doing, Jack? Are you doing something in ESRI that's giving people that kind of space to explore?
I don't think we need incentive to experience.
Okay.
You know, in a way, I'll just be confrontationalist. We all live in this world where we live in both the ordinary aspect of our world, where it's stimulus response. We get up in the morning, we go to work, we do our thing. But we also all live in this extraordinary world where we are contemplative and creative, where we design things, where we imagine the way we want it to be, or we think about the way it actually is. Contemplation is one of those disciplines. So I think it's interesting to talk about these extremes, but in a sense, we are integrative in our own sense of being to deal both with the abstract world and also with the experiential world. And in some ways, the abstract world is fundamental to us. I want to know where I'd like to live. I imagine I'd like to live on a beach or in a forest. And then we have our ordinary world where we actually realize that or not. You know what I'm talking about? This notion of both dimensions. And bringing those two things together is sort of what human life is about. For me, I walk every morning on my ranch when I'm there for about an hour. And I'm looking at how the avocados are doing, or how the oranges are growing, or how the lizards are moving. That contemplative life. Your wife's life, for example. But then I also move into this other world of abstraction, where I guess I'm using the context of abstraction to mean I live inside of an organization, I manipulate the organization in that abstract world, I deal with abstract technologies of the digital technology. So yeah, I'm not so hot on this idea we need to incentivize people to be this way or that way. I think we all live it. And we ourselves are integrative. Our mind is very integrative, using networks like you suggest. But I'm always hunting for, are there tools that we can take the way the mind works and abstract it out so we can simplify it for telling stories? So I liked, one of you said something about we need to think about telling stories. You are an amazing storyteller, isn't he?
Isn't he? I agree.
God, my mind was taken away as you told the stories, you know, about your experience. And stories that are based on real experience are always very recognizable right away. When somebody's doing bullshit or talking from their real experience, you immediately know the distinction.
I integrate both.
You integrate? It's really good. It's very good. But a map is another mechanism for telling a story. It's bigger here than there. Ebola is spreading in this direction. It's like I can not only see it, I can analyze the patterns and its relationships in a very abstract way, but also I can talk to people about what's happening in this epidemic, which, by the way, is really scary. And it's a storytelling thing. So humans need to fundamentally experience life in their science or however they do it and learn how to tell stories. I just got totally excited at the idea that maps and spatial stuff allow me to tell those stories really rapidly and leverage my experiential knowledge or my science so that everybody gets it really quickly. Mm-hmm. And your books, your storytelling are absolutely means to being able to do that.
Yeah, and I would say the storytelling itself is a process that allows us as individuals to integrate. So to tell a good story, whether it's through a visual medium, through maps, or through an acoustic medium when you're speaking, or literary medium, you have to do it well, you have to integrate the multiple levels of your own being and the tensions within you to be able to convey that story.
I want to say something about that.
Go ahead.
I just met a young man backstage from Cal Poly. Is he here? Someplace? Right there. He's third year Cal Poly. I said to him, one thing I really want you to do is learn how to write better. And when I asked him a scale of 1 to 10, he says, I'm about a 6. And so in order for you to tell your story with those fantastic words that just sounded like music to me, you wrote first. I could tell. You wrote about your thoughts, and even you referenced your writing. So the discipline of writing as a mechanism for integration is phenomenal. And some of you as scientists do your science as a mechanism for creating understanding, for creating that synthesis to be able to tell the story. So writing is one of those means. Mapping is one of those means. Data collection is one of those means. Modeling is one of those means. These are abstract ways that we sort of bring our knowledge together and communicate it.
I'm thinking of last night, Mila, when we were preparing for this panel. We were all nervous, and we were thinking about the most effective ways of getting ideas across. And Mila was very interested in showing some images. We're very fixed on saying to make a more powerful statement about what I do, how I understand trees and forests, I have to show these images.
Yes,
and we had to deny that request, unfortunately, because of logistics. But why don't you tell us, because I think, Jack, you're right, that there are many ways of telling stories, and text is one of them, but what about images, and how does that figure into our knowledge understanding?
Well, I think it all goes back. For me, I love neuroscience, I love psychology, I love the way it's to study, just as a hobby, how the brain works. And I think, you know, some people are very skilled to speak and write, and that's their way of connecting their ideas. But some others are better at expressing ourselves, not so much through writing, but through putting images that cause an impact, because behind an image there is a powerful message. I was talking to Peter that worked for you in ESRI about how I don't use my Windows phone to take notes, because I don't take notes, I take graphs. I'm very graphic. But if I could go a step farther, and here we are talking, I kind of like these connections that we are making about different disciplines, but I would like to go even farther and challenge the audience about connecting pieces of information that are not related, or apparently are not related with what you do every day in your life, and connect them to your everyday job. And this is a mental exercise that I do just for fun. I find at the end of the night when I get in bed and my children are sleeping and I have my quiet time, I would go ahead and think about something that I have learned in a fun environment. And the fun environment is key because it's going to motivate you to think about it. And I take that piece of information that seems so remote to what I do in forestry, and I try to create a connection. And indeed, there is always a connection between a piece of science and what we do, because we deal with ecosystems and people. What else is in this earth that we need to learn from? And this mental exercise allows me to create those connections in the brain. And if you do this as an exercise often, I think the brain starts wiring differently. Those neurons that exist there and the connections that happen are not there because of your genes, are there because of how you think and evolve through time. So this mental exercise, this is like going to the gym. If you start connecting, you learn this new concept about psychology. Man, I just learned today. Let me just run a quick test with this audience. And it's the connection between emotions and memory. How many of you, raise your hand, can tell me what you did last Wednesday morning? Please raise your hand if you can think about it. Great, you guys have great memory. Now raise your hand, those of you that can tell me what you did the day you found out about the news of September 11th. Right. Why is that? Because that day you had very strong, powerful emotions. So how do I use that piece of information in my everyday job, when I'm teaching? When I teach, I want my students to remember me, not in the context of September 11th, but I want them to remember me 10 years down the road about this crazy professor, that had all this energy. So what do I tap into? Their emotions. I don't tap into their messages. You guys are not going to remember me a year from now for what I said on this stage. You guys are going to remember me or us about how we made you feel. And I bet he did a great job, because I was watching the audience as he was speaking, and I saw some people with their faces like they were dreaming. And that's what impacts your memory. So if, this is just a little exercise, but if you make those connections, it's going to allow you in your profession to see things from a different perspective that you didn't before. And that is this life enrichment journey that knowledge is all about. And I leave it there.
You're talking about connections, and I connect with the emotional dimension. You're right. But I also connect where I was last Wednesday and also where I was on 9/11. So a second dimension of organization is location. And a third one is time.
Nice.
Your fundamental field of time, space, or Einstein's, everything's time and space and emotions. Now I've got to
all right, well, that's the way you feel, right?
Yeah, I'm time and space and emotional.
Got it.
I'm time in said a different way. I'm time, space referenced with experiences. Some of them are very strong emotions, and some of them are not. Some of them are laying and watching quietly when the lion comes up, or the gorilla, actually, in my experience. Now is scary. So I've got an emotional connection, I have an experiential connection, and I'm also organizing it in time and space. And in some ways, I want to make the connection between your discussion and my discussion. I mean, it's bothered me my whole life. I want to take my experience of the complexity of reality, and I also want to abstract it in such a way that I can actually share it. So after 80 years when I'm dead, that's not a forecast, by the way, but after 80 days when I'm dead, that knowledge bit is abstracted, that experience that I've had is abstracted. And writers have done this forever. They've abstracted their experiences as a book, and it goes beyond Hemingway's life or beyond the time when they're on the planet. And this idea of collective knowledge abstraction has really got me excited. Scientists know how to do this. They have their books and they have the things. But now we're in the digital age and it's accelerating. I'm not suggesting that the acceleration takes away from the extraordinary world of experience or creation, but we need to figure out how to make this connection between that and being able to share it and leverage it.
Could I add one more dimension?
Yeah.
That we talked about in the questions that we picked up, and that is the ethical facet. We've talked about emotion, we've talked about location, we've talked about time, we've talked a little bit about community, but can you discuss or bring up or
Are you suggesting that ethics are knowledge?
Yes, it's a branch of philosophy. I think that's a way of knowing, or maybe it's more beliefs, but I think different societies have a code of ethics, have things that they decide are the right ethics or the wrong ethics, and I think when foresters are making decisions that involve humans, I think those enter, and it's not that there's a fixed set of ethics, it's sort of like our crystal, again, that it's a lens through which there are many facets. But I was wondering if there's any issue or incident that came up in ethics that might shed a light on our job of trying to integrate this research management forest-human interface.
So let me try something. Because, I mean, whether it's a moral issue or an ethical issue or a human rights fundamental issue based on who we or what we believe, but many indigenous tribes around the world are claiming rights to their land, historic and traditional rights to their land. If the American Indians had had all that data that you presented, that Joanne presented today, what could they have done with that in terms of claiming traditional territories? Well, they're using that data now to do that. Unfortunately, the bad guys are also using that data, racing to the very best mining areas, racing to the very best and most fertile agricultural lands that can be converted from forest lands. And so what we have right now is this collision of competition for the best forested land on the planet. And we, because 70% of the land is owned by the government, we, as many of us in forestry, have a role to play in this. What is our role? Who do we give data to? Who do we keep it from? How do we share it? And how do we know we're giving data to people that will use it appropriately?
Great question.
That was a huge challenge for me recently.
Yeah, but how do you use it appropriately? Do you use it to optimize money or the economic dimension, or do you use it to optimize sustainability, or do you do it for to optimize the science? These are different objective functions. And they live within a frame. I mean, human beings have built this thing called objective functions. They live in a frame where you can make trade-offs.
But who makes those trade-offs, and who makes the trade-off for that culture that lives there?
I don't know if this is actually knowledge. That's why I asked you the question.
Yeah.
Or whether it's a value frame that we make trade-offs. We want some more money, but we don't want we want this, we want that. We more food versus forest sustainability.
Right.
Let's talk about I don't know the answer to that, but it would be nice to be able to alternatively lay out alternative designs and schemes and understand the consequences of it,
Yeah.
and then hold a discussion among all the players. So I don't know that knowledge, I don't know that values or ethics or however you want to, or philosophy, or knowledge. They are fundamentally in our brains, and we have values about children and just this. But I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm asking you, is that knowledge?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily knowledge, but the values or ethics that can be brought in to affect management, whether or not values are knowledge. I think that it's part of the crystal, I would say, in terms of how we make decisions. Mike, I think you had something to say, and then David.
I might be going off on a little bit of a tangent, but something that comes to me continuously is this issue of who owns what, and maybe that's what you were alluding to just now. And In my world, there are many issues that we're having to battle with. One of them has to do with who owns the microbial world, for instance. Who owns your gut microbiome, for instance. This is very complicated stuff. And an issue, in fact, it was, I picked up the latest Nature last night, and a huge issue for us that work with the movement of alien pests and pathogens around the world has to do with the Nagoya Protocol, which the United States has not signed. My country has signed it. And I'm very, very worried about that, because what it will do is it will stop people exploring around the world, because they won't be allowed to do so, or they'll only do so with great difficulty. So they won't discover the actinomycete that will save millions of people, because they're not going to be discovered in those places where there isn't a body of scientists to be able to do the work. So there's a huge ethical issue here, and there's a huge potential impediment to our future knowledge base. And it's all to do with who owns the bacterium from which the polymerase enzyme was first discovered in the Yellowstone Park, for instance. And it's those examples where some organism was discovered, or some enzyme in an organism that resulted in billions of dollars of money for some people. Well, who owned that? And should they be the right people to own it? But that is a huge ethical issue.
Who owns the knowledge is what you're talking about.
Who owns the knowledge, but also who owns the physical property, that species.
Who owns the physical properties we got?
Right.
But who owns the knowledge is for me, the really interesting aspect, because if knowledge falls in the wrong hands, we've got Hitler running the world or something.
Yeah, I mean,
David, go ahead, please.
I think it was Francis Bacon back in Elizabethan times who said knowledge is power, and we've all heard that. And so the question for me about knowledge is, given that it is power, who has access to it? And I think one hopeful sign now is the sort of decentralization of that the technology allows, that you don't need to be in a multi-million-dollar research lab or working at a big corporation or big government office to have access to some of these tools. You can do it straight from your pretty inexpensive cell phone and so forth. So that decentralization allows people who previously did not have access to that knowledge to bring it to the table. And then it doesn't resolve the challenge and the tension and the conflict, but it does level the playing field a little bit, where it's not just one group is coming in with all the technical know-how and expertise, and another group has got nothing.
Right.
And these days that is being transformed in many ways, not just in the natural resources field, but in the world of economics and communication, newspapers.
Governance,
transparency,
democracy, it has all those implications.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mila, and then Jack has a big idea that we need to hear, and then we'll sort of come to a close.
I just wanted to add to the ethical issue. Working in the field of policy, I sometimes come across to the question of how much science answers, and how much, when we do policy making, how much is in the name of science or is in the name of political agendas, and sometimes that line gets kind of fuzzy. Sure. And even in mapping criteria sometimes, when I worked for the World Resources Institute and we were defining intact forest landscapes, there was this debate within the scientific community about how much science could really define what was an IFL. How large is large enough for certain species? And science wasn't just there to kind of come up with concrete criteria for mapping purposes. And to me, this is a story that keeps happening quite often, and we as scientists don't have the guts or don't have the integrity to say, okay, we cannot answer this scientifically, period. However, we need to move on, and these are the assumptions we are going to make, and we are going to use the best we have, and so on. Instead, we kind of like pull a study here and a study there, and in the name of these studies, we push for what we believe it should be pushed. And that, for me, is one of the moral dilemmas that I come across more often.
Yes, that's true. Okay, you want to share your big idea with us?
It's actually not a big idea,
Jack?
it's just a big thought.
A big thought.
Big idea.
It deals with moral dilemmas, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the moral dilemmas is sharing data. So I shared with some of you that I've been living a life of hell the last 2 weeks because of the Ebola stuff. And we're trying to set up an information system of sharing what's going on. And so I mean, this is, I don't know how to say this, President. There's WHO, they're a player. In the United States, we have CDC, they're a player. And there's the UN, they're a player. And there's the local health organizations in each country, they're a player. They're all kind of haphazardly collecting data. And they're not sharing.
Wow.
So I'm using that as a dramatic case because then they're kind of going along and I'm just going crazy, you know, what the hell, you're not sharing, blah, 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 we need to create understanding. Oh, that's a lot different than normal organizations here in the US, federal agencies? No, not a lot different. Or there's state data versus national data, states' rights, who owns the data? Or there's certain, okay, let's make it even more real. There's different science disciplines. You know, we have the authoritative data source for vegetation, not them. And you get what I'm after here? I mean, what we have to do is lift the world up. I'm on a political statement. To be able to openly share their data more effectively, because it's getting in the way. And so what was going on in my head when you guys were talking about, there's also consequences that we might not like about sharing data because the bad guys under a certain value set may take advantage of, for their objective function, this or that. So I don't have an answer. I'd really like.
Do you think, Jack, that that could be a reflection of who pays for data these days and the competition that exists within the research community?
No, I don't think so. Well, there's the monetization of data, and we see that happening in my user community all over the place. The satellite owners and the sort of Google buying the satellite companies and trying to own it all for as kind of the big thing, versus public efforts by NASA and NOAA to be able to measure the planet and have open data services that everybody can look at it. Yeah, there's some issues about monetization, but I'm really more speaking to the issue of the ologies have their own disciplinary view of how the lens is put together, you know, their own lens of reality, and they fight about it, and they're unwilling to even share the fundamentals of their lens or their fundamental building blocks of their thing. So, I don't know, I'm ranting on. I'm just.
No, I think that's a wonderful.
I think one of the moral
example.
dilemmas that we face in the planet as it increasingly is troubled is the ability to share this knowledge effectively, and the web certainly has helped open up a lot of it, and particularly in various aspects of science, but it is the thing that you think of, oh, that's not really reality. Yes, it is reality. It's a reality that's constraining advancement of science and advancement of better management practices because we're not really getting our information shared and also integrated.
I mean, I would say that sort of looking on the last few decades in terms of what's happened with the electronic world in terms of sharing, is that when things have opened up, and I'm thinking, say, about genetics and GenBank, where, you know, if I sequence a piece of snail DNA or tree DNA, some of that data is not shared, and some of it is put out there for anyone to use.
Open.
And completely open. And, you know, you need to acknowledge and cite the people who did the original work. But that has led to such enormous advantages and advances in genetics through openness and very few costs. You know, if I spend 10 years sequencing this and I publish my papers, get the grant, get whatever my goals were, someone else in another 2 years is going to use that in a different way. And I think this is a very ecological, I mean, humans are this ecosystem of different talents and passions.
And it's changing science.
Put this information out there, I'm not worried that so much about the bad guys are going to get it, you know, this for evil and all the rest. But if it's hidden away, that all that human creativity that could be working on it, and that free markets and open sources in lots of different fields have shown us to generally produce good outcomes, that is blocked. And, you know, with Ebola, it becomes a particular problem because this is, in the very short term, we can see the negative effects of the CDC not sharing its data with some other groups. I think the same is true, say, with mapping data or with genetic data. And there are some questions about
I mean, if
genetic piracy and things. Those are all legitimate questions.
If I put a positive spin on it, I simply say the world is moving to a more open network and sharing data, which is changing science, which ultimately will change the evolution of the planet.
I think we are so lucky to be living in the time we're living in, because this information sharing and this open environment creates so much transparency that it makes it impossible for a government to hide, or the bad guys or the bad actors or whoever they are by whatever value system to hide, because it's easy. Any of us in this room can start monitoring the deforestation on a hectare of land in Brazil. Any of us in this room can start mapping indigenous territories in Indonesia. We have so much capability that we didn't have just 5 years ago. So it's a miraculous time to be in this field. It really is.
So on that optimistic last two notes, since we just have 6 minutes left before we need to close this conversation, I'd like to ask you if you have sort of an integrative insight or something you'd like to wrap up with, or something brilliant that has emerged to help us answer this question. I'd welcome that, just like a minute. Not a must.
Not a must.
I've got something. I'm picking up on the analogy of your crystal. Maybe this is the first time a crystal has been held in front of the SAF meeting. I don't know. But so the metaphor here was we're all looking through a particular crystal lens and so forth. But the other thing that is doing is reflecting light out to other crystals. And to me, the question of how do we know what knowledge is and how do we get beyond the limitations of our own lenses is to have those reflections interact with one another in conversations. And often that doesn't happen. We're blocked. We're so locked in our own disciplinary silos or institutional silos. And so mechanisms that encourage conversation and listening, particularly across big divides, which is something that we're really not good at. We're much better at holding placards and getting angry and so forth. But if the light from those, we're looking through it, but we're also reflecting back out to other people. And I think this is a small example, this conversation here of how to do that. I don't know if we're the best model.
That's a great point. And this, to reflect out on the 3,500 people here, is that this conversation that we've had is to be continued, to be reflected, and to have conversations amongst yourselves, not just during the meeting, but to continue. Great insight. I love that.
I call it intellectual jazz.
That's great. Riffing.
That was a short one. Anyone else, Mike?
I think that's a fabulous place.
Maybe we should just go ahead and stop there.
I can start. We're talking a lot about also connections and collaboration, and that's what we need. I mean, to me, that was so much of a message of listening to the plenary talks this morning, and then listening to this incredible conversation, and realizing that we've just got to learn so much from each other. We've got to communicate more. We've got to get those intersections. We've got to build those intersections.
So, I was thinking one thing that, and maybe some of you have heard this or read this before, but about 100 years ago, Gifford Pinchot was meeting with some international college, and he was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, kind of our hero in many ways. And he was meeting with some international colleagues, and he said that most wars were fought not over ideology, but over natural resources. And this is before World War I and II. And he reckoned that if we could manage our natural resources well, with wisdom, that we could directly contribute to world peace.
Wow.
And I think about that. I really like that because it reminds me, because we come at this in so many different ways with such different perspectives, and yet each in our own way we contribute to some of that wisdom. And hopefully by having more of these kind of conversations and more of these rich interactions, we can learn to be deliberate and manage with some wisdom.
That's beautiful, Sally. I love that. That's great. Mila, did you want to say anything?
Yes, I would like just to inspire the audience to really be passionate about what you do, to believe in what you do, and to let those emotions drive your professional career. Because I think indeed we are not here to work or discover. We are here to have fun and to live a life that is escaping through our fingers at a very fast rate. So enjoy it.
That's great. Fantastic. Well, I want to thank our panel, and I also, let's go ahead and thank the panel.
Yeah.
We'd also like to thank Peter Doherty, who brought us together for this exercise. Jeremy Freed, Jen Hayes, of course, who's so wonderful here with the Forest Service, Carol Rettelsheimer, and we'd like to thank this planning committee of UFRO, of SAF, and of CIF. And thank all of you for joining us and to think about where your facet is on this lens of our beautiful forest. Thank you.
And thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, yes.